Well, as you remember, we have been talking about different aspects of the second coming. And last week, we sort of looked at a big, kind of broad stroke overview. We looked at a big picture of the end times, kind of according to the pre-tribulation, premillennial dispensationalist view. And again, that's a lot of words. I know for some of you guys, this is all brand new. For some of you guys, this is just review. And last week, I really, like I said, I gave a kind of a 30,000-foot view. And this week, I want to kind of come back and we'll take a little helicopter tour. We're going to get a little closer, and we might land for a couple minutes and touch down and kind of delve a little deeper into a couple of things. And again, as I get into this, I just want to say that I am aware that some of this end time stuff, it is why some people think we're a little off the reservation, right? Some of this stuff in the end times, it's kind of wild. Some of it's kind of science fiction-y, not Scientology. Oh, there's separation there. Science fiction-y is what I'm saying, right? And it's weird. Some of it's kind of like dystopian, post-apocalyptic, and I kind of like that. But it's weird stuff. Nonetheless, it's in the book. It's in God's word, so we're going to look at it. And so I want to do just a little bit of review, and then we're going to kind of dig down a little bit. 70 AD. Titus and the Roman legions, they come into Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, they sack the city. Most of the people are deported. Those who are alive, they're deported, they're sold into slavery. Remember, we talked about how the Romans, they renamed Israel Palestinia. Sort of one last poke, one final insult to the Jews. They renamed Israel after the historic enemies of the Jews, the Philistines. So from that point on, from the destruction of the temple, Bible prophecy was mostly on pause. There wasn't a lot happening in regards to the fulfillment of prophecy. Then May 14th, 1948, Israel is reborn as a nation. And this really kind of restarts the prophetic countdown. And this rebirth of Israel, it was an amazing miracle. As we talked about, no other nation has survived culturally, religiously, linguistically for more than just a couple of generations after being assimilated into another culture. But God in his sovereignty and God in his providence, he kept Israel for 2,000 years. They're spread out all over the world and all over these different cultures, but God keeps them culturally. And then in 1948, he brings them back into the land of promise. And as we saw last week, he really had to in order for the end times events to come to fruition. So as we started to see last week, right, much of end times prophecy is predicated, number one, on there being an Israel, and number two, there being a temple in Jerusalem, right? And so currently we have number one. We do have a nation, Israel, but there is no temple in Jerusalem at this point. So most likely, the next major event on the prophetic timeline is what we talked about last week, the rapture of the church. And again, this is not to be confused with the second coming. And the second coming is we're going to see Jesus comes back down. He literally touches down on the Mount of Olives and he's here. The rapture, that's not what happens. It says that Jesus comes, but he doesn't come all the way back. And then he raptures the church away for a period of 7 years. And we talked about this at length last week. This word rapture isn't in the Bible, but the Greek word harpazo is there. And that word harpazo, it means to snatch away. And Paul talks about that in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. He talks about how in the twinkling of an eye that we will be caught up in the air to meet the Lord. And so very few Christians deny the doctrine of the rapture. The question that people have, the debate, the argument is, when will it happen? Will it happen before the Great Tribulation, in the middle of the Great Tribulation, or after the Great Tribulation? Now, as we talk about the tribulation there, the tribulation is this 7-year period that we're going to kind of drill into today. And it's during this time that there's great conflict with Israel and the nations around it. And so there's this man who rises to power, and he brokers a 7-year peace deal between Israel and her enemies. And this man is referred to as the Antichrist. Now, just to kind of make something clear, if you're familiar with Scripture, this is a capital A Antichrist. There, John talks about antichrists, and it's sort of a lower case. It's just people who are antichrist. But the capital A Antichrist is an actual person. He's referred to as the son of perdition or the man of lawlessness. And this is a lot what we're going to talk about today. As you know, typically we go chapter by chapter, verse by verse through the Scriptures. And, so I kind of always know what I'm going to be teaching the following Sunday. If I leave off on 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 4, I know that the next week I'm going to pick up in chapter 3, verse 5. So this is a little bit different. And, kind of each week I'm not sure where we're going. And so this weekend I was kind of consolidating my study, and all of a sudden I realized I've got like 3 hours worth of notes. So that's not going to work. So I'm kind of trying to kind of condense it all down, and we'll just kind of see where it leads. But I want to start this morning in Daniel chapter 8. And in Daniel chapter 8, we see this amazing prediction. I'm really just going to kind of move through it fast and touch on a few points. But we see this amazing prediction concerning the rise of Alexander the Great and then his eventual premature death. And then we see the Greek Empire after Alexander's death is broken up into 4 kingdoms. So we're going to look at Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. And this is very symbolic language, and I'm not even going to make any attempt to unpack all of this morning. But it says this in verse 9. Out of one of them came a little horn. This is out of one of those four new nations that came out of the Greek Empire. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it, together with the regular burnt offering, because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." So here's what Daniel sees. Out of one of these 4 dynasties that came from the Greek Empire, out of one of these 4 rulers comes what Daniel refers to as a little horn. Now, he says this little horn becomes exceedingly great, and he exerts his influence towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. That's a reference to Israel. And as this little horn grows, it says he grows up towards heaven, and he grabs some of the stars and tramples on them. And he begins to make his own name great, and he exalts himself. And verse 11, this little horn, this ruler, It says he takes away the daily offerings in the temple and he desecrates the sanctuary. Now, verse 23, Gabriel's going to give some of the interpretation. It says, at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. At the latter end of their kingdom. So it seems like this is talking about the latter end of the Greek Empire, when their transgressors have reached their limits. It says the king of bold face will come onto the scene. And he says that he's one who understands riddles. And I don't know if this means he's really good at crossword puzzles but I think the implication is that he's wise, that he's crafty, that he understands the ways of the world. Now, this man, this little horn, is understood to be Antiochus IV. It's said that when Alexander the Great was on his world conquest, when he approached Jerusalem with his armies, the high priest came out to meet Alexander the Great. And at the high priest, he unrolls the scroll of Daniel. And he unrolls the section in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 9, and he shows Alexander the Great where he is referred to in the scriptures. And so it's said that Alexander the Great was so impressed by this that he didn't really press himself against Israel. He pretty much just let Israel be. As it happens, that sentiment didn't last with Alexander's predecessors. So this guy, Antiochus IV, he's born in about 215 BC. And he rose to leadership in what's referred to as the Seleucid dynasty. This was a dynasty, one of the four kingdoms that was based in Babylon. And he begins to expand his power. And this guy, Antiochus, he was known for being particularly zealous about spreading Greek culture and Greek religion. And it was called Hellenizing. They would Hellenize the world. They would try to put Greek influence all over the world. And so what he would do is he would plant Greek cities in all these non-Greek areas. And as it happens, in the book of Acts, one of the most prominent cities is the city of Antioch. Right? Antioch was named after this guy, Antiochus. So Antiochus, he had issues with the Jews because the Jews refused to submit to Greek culture. They refused to submit to the Greek religion. And so this guy, Antiochus, apparently he was either a complete megalomaniac or a little bit insane or probably both. But he renames himself and he calls himself Antiochus Epiphanes. And that whole name, it means God manifest. And so you can kind of see what kind of guy this is, right? He refers to himself as God manifest. And the Jews, being who they were, this rubbed them a little bit wrong, that he referred to himself as God in the flesh. And the Jews, really, they liked puns and they liked word games. And so they nicknamed him Antiochus Epiphanes. It sounds almost the same as Antiochus Epiphanes. But instead of meaning God manifest, it means the madman. Instead of the God man, they called him the madman. They said, you, sir, are crazy. So, according to my understanding of the events, Antiochus is pressing the Jews, trying to convert them, trying to Hellenize them. And there's a revolt against Antiochus. And there was a priest by the name of Mattatyahu. And he had 5 sons. And he and his 5 sons, they led a rebellion against Antiochus. And so this had been kind of going on for a while. And Antiochus left and he goes over to do battle in Egypt and he loses this fight in Egypt. So So he's coming back home to Babylon. And he's already in a bad mood because he just got beat up. And he's looking for somebody to take his aggression out on. He's looking for somebody to be mad at. And these zealous Jews, they seem like a good target. So Antiochus rolls into the promised land. He outlaws Judaism. He stops the sacrifices in the temple. He bans circumcision. And eventually he goes into the temple in 174 BC. He walks into the temple and he builds an altar to Zeus. And then he takes a hog and he sacrifices this pig on the altar. And then he forces the priests to drink the blood of this pig. And this causes what's referred to in verse 13 as the transgression that makes desolate. Or some of your translations will say the abomination that causes desolation. So during this time, there's this full-on rebellion. And it's what's known as the Maccabean Wars. And the Jews, they rise up against Antiochus. And it's said that when Antiochus first came in, on the very first day, he immediately killed 40,000 Jews. And over the course of the next couple weeks and months, he kills a couple 100,000 more. But eventually, the Maccabeans, they're successful in driving out the Greeks, and they rededicate the temple to the Lord. It says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 24, his power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. So this king, this little horn, Antiochus, Daniel says he's going to be powerful, but not by his own power. If he isn't great by his own power, then who's empowering him? Is God empowering him? Is it Satan? Is it a reference to sort of riding on Alexander the Great's coattails? As we'll see later, it seems to be like he was empowered by Satan. He was a possessed man. And it says that he shall cause fearful destruction and will be successful in dominating. What Daniel's saying is he's really, really good at being really, really bad. It says that he will succeed in destroying mighty men and the people who are the saints. And of course, he's referring to the massacre of the Jews in Jerusalem. By his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. And in his own mind, he shall become great. That's a description of a lot of people, isn't it? In his own mind, he shall become great. Without warning, he shall destroy many. And he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. And he shall be broken, but by no human hand. So this is where things start to get a little weird in this prophecy. So far, it's pretty clear that this prophecy is about this man Antiochus, right? It fits the historical narrative perfectly, exactly. But here's why it starts to get passage, right? Antiochus fulfills everything to a T so far. But now in verse 25, it says, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. Now, the prince of princes is a reference to the Messiah. It's a reference to Jesus. And obviously, Antiochus didn't rise up against Jesus because Jesus wouldn't be born for nearly 2 centuries. So that's a major difficulty with this passage, right? Second, Antiochus is also referred to as the little horn. Now, if you go back to Daniel chapter 7, the little horn is a clear reference to the Antichrist who is yet future. So how can the Antichrist be Antiochus if Antiochus, right, he's not on the scene today, right? So there's a little disjoint here, right? And not even to mention that it's the Antichrist who initiates the abomination that causes desolation, that defiling of the temple. I mean, it seems like Antiochus completed this prophecy in 174, except for that pesky little Matthew chapter 24, right? Jesus is talking to the Jews about the end times in Matthew chapter 24. And he says in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and then Jesus goes on to give some instructions. But the point is that Jesus is speaking of this abomination that causes desolation as being a yet future event. So from Jesus' perspective, the abomination that causes desolation that Daniel refers to, it hasn't happened yet. Are you guys tracking with me so far? All right, this is yet future. So how could Antiochus be the fulfillment of this prophecy if it was yet future in Jesus' time and Antiochus lived 200 years before Jesus? It's a good question, right? The math doesn't quite work out there. I'm like, you carry the two, and it's just like, I don't know. Here's what I believe. Yes, Antiochus fulfilled these prophecies. He caused the abomination that causes desolation. He defiled the temple. And it is also still in the future. There's sort of a dual fulfillment of this prophecy. Antiochus was a type of Antichrist. Remember a few weeks ago we were talking about typology in the Bible and about how that the whole thing with Abraham and Isaac as they went up Mount Moriah, it was a type or a prophetic foreshadowing of the father sacrificing his son. And we looked at the typology of the Passover lamb and how it was a prophetic picture of Jesus going to the cross, right? Antiochus was a type or a prophetic foreshadowing of the Antichrist. And this interpretation, right, it allows for Antiochus to fulfill those prophecies, and it still allows for what Jesus said in Matthew 24 to be true. And it also makes sense what Gabriel says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 17. He says that this vision is for the time of the end. And then he goes on in verse 26, he says, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. He says, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So Daniel receives this vision, and he's kind of stressed by it, and Gabriel says, listen, Daniel, don't worry. This stuff isn't going to happen for a really long time. This is talking about the end times. You can seal it up and not stress about it. Now, Daniel chapter 9 gives us some more detail. It says in verse 20, while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sins of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. So it says Daniel was presenting his plea for the holy hill of God. That holy hill, it's a reference to the temple in Jerusalem. And so Daniel is praying for the restoration of Jerusalem and the restoration of the temple. And Daniel says, in the midst of my prayer, Daniel shows up. It says that he came to me in swift flight. Now, I don't know how this whole thing played out, but in my mind, it was very Iron Man-esque. He kind of comes in, lands in front of Daniel, swoops in. And then Gabriel proclaims this. He says in verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. 70 weeks. Now, a few weeks back, we talked about this 70 weeks, so I don't want to go very far into that this morning because that's a whole nother lesson. But he says 70 weeks are decreed. And remember that word weeks in the Hebrew, it doesn't only mean weeks in the sense that we use the word weeks, right? The Hebrew word is heptad. And that word heptad, it means a group of 7. And it is commonly used to refer to a week, but not exclusively. Any group of 7 can be referred to as a heptad. And generally, scholars across the board understand the 70 weeks means 70 groups of 7 something. And most scholars believe it refers to 70 groups of 7 years. And that interpretation, it fits contextually, linguistically, historically. Now, without going any further into that, we're just going to accept that understanding for now. We're talking about 70 groups of 7 years. 490 years, he says, are decreed for your people and your holy city. Now, who are Daniel's people? Not the Babylonians, not the Norwegians, not the Mayans, right? He's talking about the Jewish people. Daniel was a Hebrew. And he says, for your holy city. Again, what city? Well, not Moscow, not Nineveh, not Singapore, right? Daniel's city was Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, the capital of Israel. So Gabriel says these things that we're looking at, they have to do with the Jews and with Jerusalem. And he says 70 weeks or 490 years are decreed about your people and your holy city to do 6 things, he says in the text there. He says to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophecy, and to anoint a most holy place. So we have this checklist here. He says within this 490-year period, these 6 things are going to be accomplished. 6 things are going to happen in your holy city, among your holy people. Number 1, to finish transgression. Transgression means like to cross a line. It's a reference to like willful, purposeful sin. He says transgression, that willful sin will be finished. There will be perfect righteousness on earth. He says to put an end to sin, sort of similar. He said sin will be done. There will be an end of it. Again, he's referencing a perfect sinless world. Number 3, to atone for iniquity, to pay the penalty for sin. Number 4, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Sort of the same thing, a new structure of society, a perfect sinless society. To seal both vision and prophecy, right? To complete all the visions and all the prophecies that were foretold. And to anoint a most holy place. And again, he's referring here to the holy place in the temple in Jerusalem. The most holy place, the Holy of Holies, that place where the Ark of the Covenant dwells, where the Shekinah glory of God dwells. He says that holy place will be anointed, it will be blessed. Now, as we look at that list, it seems like some of those things were completed already, some might be, and some are definitely not done yet. Right? To finish transgression. Right? It doesn't seem like transgression is finished, does it? Look around the world, it's pretty wretched. Right? To put an end to sin. Again, look around. It's clear that sin is still rampant. So those 2 things, probably not. To atone for iniquity, yes. Iniquity was definitely atoned for on the cross. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, righteousness is definitely not dominating the world today, is it? So to seal up both vision and prophecy. There is still unfulfilled prophecy. There's prophecy that hasn't come true yet. So that's certainly not done. To anoint a most holy place. Well, there's no temple today, so that hasn't been done. So in those 6 things that are going to be completed, there's a couple of no's, 1 yes, and a couple of maybes, right? Look what he says again in verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in troubled times. So we are told that this prophetic clock, it starts right here. And we are also told that when 69 of these 70 weeks end, right, and so we're given detail here on 483 of these 490 years. He says when the clock starts, or he says when the command is given to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the coming of the prince or the anointed one, he says that's going to be 483 years. And so that decree is given. And it sort of starts this whole prophetic clock again. And so it says it ends when the anointed one arrives. Some of your translations say when Messiah the Prince arrives. That Hebrew word is Mashiach. And it means the anointed one, the Christ. And the word prince here is Nagid. And it doesn't mean prince and the way that we think. You know, when we think of a prince, we sort of think of junior royalty, right? Maybe he'll be king someday. But this word prince in the Old Testament, it was a title that was used of kings and of rulers and of commanders. It was a designation of authority. So he says this Mashiach Nagid, this Messiah the King is coming. And he says, from the issuing of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until Mashiach Nagid is anointed king, it'll be 483 years. And we talked about this whole thing a couple weeks ago. How Jesus, he strolls into Jerusalem and he presents himself as Messiah on exactly April 6, 32 AD. And that is exactly 173,880 days after March 14th, 445 BC, the day that the decree was issued to rebuild Jerusalem. And we're not going to unpack that whole thing again, but there is so much evidence of a supernatural engineering of scriptures. So much amazing prophecy in scripture. It's remarkable. So 69 of those 70 weeks were completed in 32 AD when Jesus came in and presented himself as the Messiah. So there's one of these prophetic weeks, one of these prophetic 7-year periods that's left. Verse 26 says, after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Now, don't be confused by 62 weeks. That's coming after the 7 weeks of the preceding verse. So he says, after 69 weeks are finished, after 483 years, the Messiah will be cut off. And that word cut off, it's a legal term. It refers to a judicial execution. It doesn't mean to, die in a weird accident. It doesn't mean a coconut falls on your head or you slip in the shower. This is an execution that Daniel is referring to. He says that the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Other translations say the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. I think that's a little bit better rendering there. Jesus wasn't executed for himself. He wasn't executed for his own sin. He wasn't executed because of his own guilt. He went to the cross for you. He paid the penalty for my sins on the cross. So Daniel here, he says that after the 69th week, all this stuff is going to happen. And he says, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. So Daniel tells us what will happen after the 69th week. He says the Messiah is going to die, and then the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The people of the prince who is to come are going to come in and destroy the city, Jerusalem, and the temple. Again, remember, in 70 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans. Titus and the Roman legions come in like a flood, like Daniel says, and they destroy the city and the temple, killing an estimated 1.1 million people. And it says the people of the prince come to destroy the city. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem, right? Ergo, the people of the prince are the Roman people. And the prince to come is a reference to the Antichrist that we were talking about. So he says, the people of the prince are the Romans. And as we'll see in the coming verse, right, it's talking about this man of perdition that's going to come to power. And so Daniel says the people of the Antichrist are the ones who are going to come and destroy Jerusalem and the temple. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So he, referring to the Antichrist, will make a covenant with the many for a week. So here's our missing week, that 70th week that we were talking about. So who is the he and who is the many referred to in verse 27? The many is easy. And in Hebrew, it's clear that the many is a reference to the people of Israel, the Jewish people as a whole. And who is the he who makes this covenant? It's the prince who is to come, the prince that we just talked about in verse 26. And so it seems here to allude to a break in the timeline, and we're going to discuss that more in a minute. But this prince who is referenced wasn't around in 70 AD, right? It says the people of the prince who is to come. So again, this is a reference to the Romans. The prince who is to come, the Antichrist, comes from the Roman people. Well, who are the Romans? Well, where's Rome? Italy. So it's easy to say, oh, the Antichrist must be Italian. Any Italians here? It's not as easy a question as it might seem, though. Here's what would happen. The Roman Empire, they would conquer a region, right? And they would assimilate it into the Roman Empire. And then once that region was assimilated, they would give all the young males in the population an opportunity to join the Roman legion. And it was really a great opportunity. If you joined the Roman legion, it was a path to citizenship, right? If you joined the Roman legion and you survived, there were great retirement benefits. Once you retired, you were given citizenship. You were given land in a new settlement. It was a very good career option. So there were many people who joined the Roman legion and became citizens. Now, predominantly Romans were Southern Europeans. They were from that region around Italy. But there were many Northern Europeans, there were Asians, there were Africans as well who are part of the Roman Empire. So Daniel says that the prince to come will come from the geography and the legacy of the Roman Empire. Now, this prince who is to come, it's thought that he's most likely going to come from Europe, but we don't really know. But this coming prince is going to make a 7-year peace treaty with Israel. Now, for most of my life, I think for most of our lives here, the Middle East has been a place of great turmoil, hasn't it? Ever since Israel became a state again in 1948, and even before that, really, there's been constant conflict. I mean, I remember growing up, our presidents were always trying to help broker peace between the PLO and Hamas and Israel. I remember Bill Clinton went over there and the Camp David Accords, and everybody's, Bill Clinton's the Antichrist and all that. And there's all these rockets and suicide bombers and walls going up and fences and tearing down of settlements. And as we've seen over the last year, it's only getting crazier and crazier, right? Wouldn't it be nice if somebody could broker a peace treaty between Israel and the rest of the Middle East? Wouldn't it be nice if somebody could rise and come to power and solve all these geopolitical issues and bring real peace? I mean, that'd be great. That person would be almost Messiah-like, wouldn't they? Right? That's exactly what's being described here. The Antichrist is going to rise up and he's going to create peace in that region. In fact, many Jews initially are going to think that he is the Messiah. They're going to think that the Antichrist is the Prince of Peace. They're going to be deceived. And it says, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And for half of the week, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. So this coming prince, he makes a peace deal here in Israel, a 7-year peace treaty between Israel and her enemies. Halfway through, however, he breaks the treaty. And it says he puts an end to sacrifice and offering. The implication here is that the temple has already been rebuilt in Jerusalem. You can't have temple sacrifices in Jerusalem without a temple, right? We talked about that last week. And halfway through this 7-year thing, the Antichrist comes in and he breaks his deal with the Jews. Now, this is interesting, because remember back in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, Daniel is speaking about this prince, this ruler from among the revived Roman Empire. And he says, he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. A time, times, and half a time. In this context, time means a year. So you have a time, times, and a half a time. Right? You can do the math, or you can see my little fingers. That's 3.5. For 3.5 years. For 3.5 years, the people were given over to the will of this little horn, this prince to come, the Antichrist. Right? Halfway through this 7-year peace deal, he breaks his word and he turns on the Jews. And then that thing that we talked about in Daniel 9:27 happens. And on the wing of the abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. In the Old Testament, this word abomination, it usually is a reference to a terrible, severe idolatry. And we saw that with Antiochus. Remember, he slaughtered pigs on the altar, and he forced the priests to drink the pig's blood. And it seems like that same type of abomination is going to take place in the new temple. The Antichrist will set up a horrific idolatry in the temple. Paul talks about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He says, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So this Antichrist, after 3.5 years, he breaks his deal with the Jews, and then he begins to very aggressively persecute the Jews. And he commits a great genocide against the Jews. And consequently, throughout history, the Jewish people have been oppressed by so many different nations. And every time, just like in this instance, we see that anti-Semitism, it is satanically, demonically inspired. The Antichrist, he begins to persecute the Jews. He begins to slaughter them en masse. And so in additional detail, this whole period, this whole 7-year period is referred to as the tribulation. But the second half, the second 3.5-year period, it's referred to as the Great Tribulation. The really bad tribulation, right? And by and large, the Jews were shielded from the first half. But now it really opens up and it's poured out on the Jews. Now, I think this is where we're going to stop today. I had a whole bunch more I wanted to get to. But let me just say this in closing. We have all this stuff unfolding around us. All this turmoil in the Middle East. And all of this is pointing us towards the eventual rapture of the church. It's all funneling us towards the rise of the Antichrist and the tribulation period, and then eventually the second coming of Christ. And so we can look around and we see all the wickedness and all the evil in the world and the wars and rumors of wars and just the depravity of our society and all of these things. And it's easy to freak out. It's easy to lose hope. But remember, God is in control. He foretold that all of these things would happen. And second, Jesus. We see through this that Jesus loves you, that Jesus died to pay for your iniquities and sins, and that Jesus is coming back to take us home. That's glorious news, isn't it? He loves us, he died for us, and he's coming back to take us home.